Exploring Stories. William S. Allen. Experience in the Bataan Death March. William S.'s story with the military begins in February 1941. He was deployed to the Philippines by the American government. They were alarmed by the rapid buildup of Japanese troops in the region and had began mobilizing the American forces. Mr. Allen was with the Army, though the full extent of the threat remained unclear to anyone. Just 3 months prior, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor and had signaled the beginning of a broader conflict. A whole year later, in April 1942, the situation had deteriorated significantly. The Japanese had begun overrunning much of the Philippines, leaving only the Bataan Peninsula as the final stronghold. General Douglas MacArthur, having recognized the dire circumstances, made a dramatic escape to Australia. On April 9th, 1942, the only remaining American and Filipino troops, including Mr. Allen's battalion, were compelled to surrender. It was a somber day that marked the end of their grueling defense. As the Japanese forces began their approach, they knew they were going to be searched for their weapons. Allen and his fellow soldiers faced a critical decision: keep their weapons or dispose of them. Under orders to dispose, they dismantled their .45 automatic pistols and M1 Garand rifles, scattering the parts into the nearby surrounding wood. This was a desperate attempt to prevent the enemies from capturing their equipment. The Japanese had faced the American defense for months, yet they would still go on to tell the Americans they were cowards for surrendering. Obviously, the Japanese soldiers held a strong belief that surrender was an unforgivable act, and they would rather commit suicide than face capture. Allen would later rebuke what the Japanese would say. He is quoted by saying, "They used to say Americans this, Americans that, claiming our surrender was disgraceful. They believed a Japanese soldier would rather die than surrender. But of course, the war ended with Japan's surrender, leading to the atomic bombs and the conclusion of the conflict." And honestly, Allen kinda got him. But, of course, following the surrenders, the prisoners were forced to endure what was called the infamous Bataan Death March. We were herded onto the main road from San Fernando and began a brutal 60-mile march, Allen recounts. The prisoners were marched for days on end with little respite and under constant supervision by the Japanese guards. At night, they were forced to camp in the open fields, often surrounded by the harsh conditions and wet terrain. Malaria and dysentery were rampant and devastating. Allen was one of the fortunates to not contact malaria thanks to his vigilance. He took extreme precautions, covering every inch of his skin and using mosquito nets to protect himself while he slept. Despite his efforts, nearly 3/4 of his fellow prisoners fell ill with malaria, a disease that proved deadly in the squalid conditions of the camp. And it wasn't just disease that they needed to worry about. There was also pests like mice, rats, bugs, and then there was the element of human skin. It was very easy to develop rash, sunburns, tropical ulcers, which were also called at the time jungle rot. It was easy to get lesions, infections, and having different types of parasites burrow and live in your intestines. The conditions in the camp were abysmal. Allen describes the living situation with grim detail. We lived in filthy conditions with minimal food and water. Many prisoners died from malaria and dysentery. The suffering was immense. One particularly harrowing memory was his time on burial detail at Cabinu Tuan. We had to bury 24 dead POWs, he explains. They were nothing but skeletons by the time we carried them to their mass graves. We dug 2 large pits and placed 12 bodies in each before covering them. Most of them had dog tags, and later, after the war, these remains were exhumed and identified, sending them back home. The brutality of the Japanese guards was unrelenting. Alan recounts how soldiers who couldn't keep up were just left to die in the open. If someone fell behind, they were simply left behind. There were also instances when fellow prisoners were shot for having items they weren't supposed to possess. Memorabilia from home, extra food. Despite the harsh treatment from their captors, Alan remembers moments of unexpected kindness from the Filipino citizens. Occasionally, along the way, Filipinos would provide them with food and water. They obviously didn't support the Japanese, and they tried to help them wherever they could. Alan, reflecting on his experiences, underscores the inhumanity of war and the strength required to endure such trials. Alan, one of the lucky ones, managed to survive as a prisoner of war for 3 years before returning home. During the Bataan Death March, it's estimated that roughly 2,500 Filipinos and 500 Americans died, although the exact number is unknown. After the Bataan Death March, Alan referred to a period called the Great Dying, in which some estimated 26,000 Filipinos and 1,500 Americans died at Camp O'Donnell. Mr. Allen would pass away in 2011 as the absolute GOAT he is. With that being said, thank you so much for listening. If you still are, please consider subscribing, liking, or commenting on my channel. It helps me grow the channel and lets me know what you would like to hear or see for my next content. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your night. Surviving the march, only to walk into the prisoner of war camp and to be a victim of starvation and more disease. Mr. Allen was smart. He saved the food he could and volunteered his extra time for extra rations. He remained in the camp for 3.5 years, where he was freed during an American raid, freeing all other POWs at the same time. He returned home, seeing his mom first.